Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the nuts and bolts of filmmaking, specifically looking at the roles behind the camera, producers mainly.
Yeah, and our way in is, well, all the discussion around Blake Lively's producer credit for It Ends With Us, especially that PGA designation people keep mentioning.
Exactly. We've seen a lot online, articles, discussions, pointed questions from listeners really driving this. The big one seems to be, what does it really mean for Blake Lively to have that producer credit? And crucially, was the PGA mark earned?
Right. There was even that specific comment, wasn't there, suggesting that if she got the PGA credit without sort of pulling her weight compared to Justin Baldoni, maybe it suggests something, well, dodgy, like extortion.
Pretty strong stuff. And that's exactly the kind of tangled situation we like to explore here.
Right.
So our mission, if you will, for this deep dive, let's break down the producer roles, look at Blake Lively's actual involvement, and try to figure out if that PGA credit makes sense in context.
Okay, let's do it. First things first, that PGA, or PGA mark, what is it? According to the Producers Guild of America itself, it's a certification. It's not just about being a member of the guild.
Ah, okay, so it's specific to the film.
Exactly. It certifies that the person performed the majority of the producing functions on that specific movie. And this is key, they did it in a decision-making capacity.
Decision-making. So it's about having actual influence, not just like being on set.
Precisely. It implies substantial hands-on contribution and authority. So the core question isn't just the title, but does the evidence of her work line up with what that PGA certification stands for?
Got it. So Blake Lively is credited as producer PGA on It Ends With Us. We see it on IMDb, the official site. She's listed alongside Alex Sachs and Jamie Heath.
Right. And what's really interesting, or maybe complicates the picture, are Justin Baldoni's own words from during the production.
Oh, yeah. What did he say back then?
Well, he was apparently quite positive. Said she was, and I quote, involved in every area of production. Called her a creative force. So brilliant.
Wow. That's pretty high praise.
It is. He also apparently said her performance would help so many women feel seen, and even called her a powerhouse to work with.
A powerhouse. Okay, so how does that square with the narrative that cropped up later, suggesting she sort of took over or wasn't really supposed to be producing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It does seem contradictory. And then you have these text messages.
Texts. Tell me more.
These are reportedly from February 2023.
Oh.
Now, this is before filming started, and actually pretty soon after Blake had her fourth baby.
Okay.
In these texts to Baldoni, she refers to herself as a producer and marketer for the film.
She called herself that to him.
Yep. And apparently his response showed no objection at all. In fact, it sounds like he was encouraging her, happy to have her as a stakeholder right from the get-go.
Okay, that really throws a wrench in the idea that she was just the actress who muscled her way into a producer role later on. It sounds like it was understood from early days.
It certainly paints a different picture than the Takeover narrative. And it wasn't just talk, apparently. There are accounts suggesting she was deeply involved in the actual making of the film.
Like how?
Well, echoing Baldoni's earlier comment, descriptions say she was involved in every area of production. There are even mentions of her directing some parts of the film and rewriting scenes. The rooftop scene is one specifically mentioned.
Directing.
Yeah.
Rewriting. Okay, that sounds like, well, like producing. Definitely more than just acting.
It absolutely does. Which brings us back to that narrative that emerged later, this idea that she somehow seized control, or was, as someone put it, never anything more than an actress.
Yeah, how do those two things reconcile? The early texts, Baldoni's initial praise, her alleged deep involvement, versus this later takeover story.
It's hard to square, honestly. It suggests either a major shift happened or the initial understanding was different from what was later portrayed. It points towards a collaborative setup initially, at least.
Right. And, the whole thing about her making her own edit of the film, apparently creating a producer's cut is actually pretty normal. It's part of the process for many producers.
That's true. It's a way for a key creative stakeholder to present their vision for the final product.
But here's the kicker. Reports say that even though she made her cut, and presumably Baldoni had his vision too, it was Sony that had final cut approval.
Ah, Sony, the distributor.
Exactly. And apparently, Sony chose to go with Lively's version of the film.
Okay, now that is a significant detail. If the studio with ultimate authority preferred her cut, it says a lot about its quality or alignment with their goals, regardless of any internal dynamics.
Right. It kind of undermines the idea that she just forced her way in without merit if the final decision maker backed her vision.
Definitely adds another layer. Now, let's quickly touch on those different producer titles because it can get confusing.
Good idea. We've got producer, PGA, executive producer, associate producer.
Right. So Lively, Sachs, Heath, and Christy Hall are listed as producer, with Lively having the PGA mark. Then there's a whole list of executive producers: Steve Sarowitz, Todd Black, Colleen Hoover, Andrew Kaloff, Andrea Jemian, John Logan Pearson.
What's the typical difference between a producer and an executive producer?
Generally speaking, an executive producer EP role is often more about the bigger picture, like securing financing, maybe key casting, overseeing distribution deals, marketing strategy. They might not be involved in the day-to-day grind on set.
More high level, maybe financial or strategic.
Often, yes. Whereas the producer title, especially with that PGA mark, implies that hands-on daily involvement in creative and logistical decision-making throughout the entire process, pre-production, filming, post-production.
Okay, so how did that fit with Lively's situation? Because Baldoni's lawsuit actually mentions her credit.
It does. According to those court documents, Lively was initially granted an executive producer credit during her contract negotiations around the end of December 2022.
An executive producer credit first.
Yes. The lawsuit apparently notes this is common for actors of her stature. But interestingly, it also says Wayfarer and Sony initially demurred. Basically, they hesitated or had reservations about giving her a straight producer credit right away.
Why?
They reportedly felt it didn't accurately reflect her role at that initial stage. Emphasis on initial.
So she started as an EP, which is common, but they weren't sure about the full producer title then. But later she got the producer credit and the PGA mark.
Exactly. Which suggests her role and demonstrated contributions evolved or became more apparent during the production process, leading to that higher recognition.
Let's look at those other EPs. Do their roles fit that more typical EP profile?
It seems so. Steve Sarowitz co-founded Wayfarer, Baldoni's company. Andrew Kaloff is Wayfarer's president of production. Todd Black has connections to Sony. Colleen Hoover, of course, wrote the book. These roles align with financing, company oversight, IP rights holders.
What about Andrea Ejemian? She's listed as an EP too.
Right. She was the unit production manager, UPM. A UPM handles the day-to-day logistics, budget, scheduling, crewing up. It's a critical hands-on role during filming.
So why an EP credit for the UPM? That seems unusual.
It can happen. Sometimes it recognizes a contribution that went significantly above and beyond the standard UPM duties, or perhaps reflects a pre-existing relationship or deal structure. It suggests her logistical management was seen as a major strategic contribution.
Okay, so Lively gets the PGA mark later. This leads to the idea that maybe Baldoni and Heath didn't want her to have it initially.
Well, that's where the narrative gets really contentious. There are suggestions they tried to deny it, but ultimately she qualified based on the Guild's criteria, and it was awarded to her. It wasn't theirs to simply give or withhold if she met the standards.
Which brings us to that letter.
Exactly. This reported June 26th letter from Baldoni and Heath to the Producers Guild about Lively's PGA mark.
And
then, supposedly, an email from Heath the very next day, June 27th, claiming they felt extorted into writing that letter.
Extorted.
The claim seems to be that they felt under a continuous perceived threat from Lively. The implication, reading between the lines of the legal arguments, is that the threat was related to her potentially going public with her negative experiences or allegations about the set.
So the argument is, we felt pressured to support her PGA mark application, or give her the creative control that led to the mark because we were afraid she'd speak out.
That seems to be the core of Wayfarer's civil extortion claim. They're arguing that this pressure forced them to give her something of value, creative control, the recommendation letter for the mark, unwillingly.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot. Let's shift gears slightly. What about the costume designer, Eric Damon?
Right. This is another interesting piece. Damon worked with Blake Lively for years on Gossip Girl, like 5 years.
So they have a history. A long professional relationship.
Exactly. And some observers find it a bit strange then, this idea that Blake would suddenly try to wrestle control over wardrobe from someone she knew and presumably respected professionally.
What's Damon's style like? And Blake's?
Damon's known for a pretty distinct, often described as eclectic style. You see it in how Lily Bloom is dressed in the movie. Blake Lively, on the other hand, is a huge fashion figure in her own right. Constantly on best dressed lists, known for a very specific, often quite polished personal style.
So the argument is, why would Blake, the style icon, be fighting to impose the specific, maybe less conventionally fashionable look seen on Lily Bloom, it doesn't quite track with her own aesthetic.
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive. It paints a picture, potentially, of collaboration rather than conflict over wardrobe, which again bumps up against the takeover narrative.
And didn't Daven post something supportive?
Yeah, there was an Instagram post where he seemed really positive about working with Blake again. People pointed out the contrast, him saying he's happy to work with her, while the other narrative suggests she was difficult in trying to seize control in areas like wardrobe.
It doesn't quite add up, does it?
Yeah.
There was also chatter about budgets and maybe Blake using her own clothes sometimes.
Yeah, discussions about whether she supplemented the wardrobe budget herself, which, if true, further complicates the idea she was just destructively interfering. It sounds more like investment, maybe.
Okay, so let's try and map this onto a timeline. People online have been trying to piece this together, right?
Yes, there are efforts to create these collaborative timelines. One point that often comes up is how early Lively's initial complaint reportedly surfaced within the first 21 days of filming.
That is early. A sign of trouble brewing right near the start.
And then, fast forward to around the movie's premiere in August, that's when observers noticed an uptick in negative comments online, even a dedicated forum popping up that was critical.
A snark sub, as they call them.
Something like that. And this has led to speculation. Was this the beginning of an organized smear campaign aimed at Lively?
What kind of comments were appearing then? Were they about the movie generally or specifically targeting her role or her character?
That's a good question. The claim is that some comments specifically questioning her producer role appeared very early, maybe even before widespread public discussion or reviews, which made some suspicious. Were they really organic reactions or something more coordinated?
Seeding doubt early?
Possibly. And then there are claims this alleged campaign got another boost more recently, perhaps after a documentary came out that seemed to lean more towards Lively's side of the story.
So repeated efforts to shape the narrative against her.
That's the theory. And it all circles back to those February 2023 texts again. Baldoni's initial support versus the later claims she was power-hungry or overstepping.
The idea being that portraying her as difficult or grasping for control serves to undermine her credibility regarding any allegations she made about the production.
That's the connection people are drawing, yes. To paint her actions not as legitimate producer contributions, but as aggressive moves designed to discredit her complaints.
Which brings us back to that civil extortion claim from Wayfarer against Lively and Ryan Reynolds.
Right. The claim focuses on that alleged thing of value, the PGA mark, or the recommendation for it.
So Wayfarer is saying, essentially, we felt continuously threatened, implicitly, by the possibility she'd go public with allegations, especially after return-to-work demands in late 2023. This fear led us to grant her creative control, which then qualified her for the PGA mark.
That seems to be the shape of their legal argument, that the control, and thus the mark, wasn't freely given but extracted under duress.
It sounds legally complex. Are there doubts about whether that holds up?
There certainly are questions being raised. Does the alleged conduct threatening to quit, maybe not promoting the film, actually meet the legal definition of extortion? That requires a specific kind of threat for an unlawful purpose.
And proving damages seems tricky too, right?
Very. The movie did well commercially, so where's the financial harm to Wayfarer from her getting the PGA mark? Some argue the mark itself has little direct economic value. It's more about recognition. Proving tangible damages could be a hurdle.
So lots of legal knots to untie there. What about other motivations floating around?
Well, there's speculation about the marketing plan. Did Baldoni go off script from what was agreed with Sony? Did that damage his relationship with the studio?
And did Sony step in?
Some reports suggest Sony managed the promotion professionally despite any internal issues. There's also the observation that, publicly at least, much of the cast seemed to distance themselves from Baldoni during the promo tour, which some people interpret as significant.
Yeah, that was noticeable.
And then you just have the sheer inconsistency in Baldoni's own reported statements, praising her highly early on, then later accounts suggesting she took over and the PGA mark wasn't deserved. It fuels the counter-narrative that this is pushback against her allegations.
Right. The smear campaign idea is retaliation.
Exactly. But it's crucial to remember, as we said, the PGA mark isn't Baldoni's to give or take away. It's awarded by the Producers Guild based on their assessment of the work performed against their own criteria.
So wrapping this all up, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
I think first, Blake Lively was involved as a producer, conceptually at least, very early on. Second, her contributions were, at least initially, acknowledged and even praised by Baldoni himself.
Third, that narrative of a simple takeover seems much more complicated when you look at the timeline, the texts, Sony's final cut decision.
Definitely. And fourth, the PGA credit signifies substantial decision-making work awarded independently by the Guild based on submitted evidence of that work.
So revisiting that initial listener question, was it straight-up extortion? Based on everything we've looked at, her involvement seems pretty well documented and significant. The extortion claim, while part of the legal battle, looks complex and maybe faces some challenges. It doesn't seem quite so simple.
No, it rarely is. Understanding the different roles, the sequence of events, the various perspectives, it's all crucial context for making sense of these kinds of industry disputes. It shows how messy filmmaking can get behind the scenes.
Absolutely. It really highlights how narratives get constructed, doesn't it?
It really does.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about how stories get shaped, especially in high-profile situations like this. How important is it to look beyond the headlines, examine the evidence from different angles, and maybe reserve judgment? Perhaps even, look up the actual PGA criteria yourself. See what it really takes to own that mark. It might give you a whole new perspective on what goes into making a movie.
Good point. There's always more beneath the surface.
Indeed. Thanks for diving deep with us today.